Rex found it on a Wednesday morning in October, the way he found most things worth finding, by refusing to go anywhere else until Thomas paid attention. Thomas Garrett had been walking the east boundary of his father's property every morning since he arrived in September. 60 acres of Virginia Piedmont, old pasture going back to scrub, a woodlot along the north edge, a creek at the south boundary that ran clear except after hard rain. He walked it because he needed to understand what he had inherited, and because walking was easier than thinking about why he had inherited it, which was that his father, Earl Garrett, had died in April at 81, alone in the farmhouse he had lived in since 1962. Thomas had not been there when it happened. He lived in Roanoke, 2 hours away, and he had been meaning to drive out more often and had not done it, and now there was no more often to have. Rex walked the boundary with him every morning, slightly ahead, and to the left the way he had been trained to move, checking the fence line, reading the edges of the property with his nose, the way Thomas read them with his eyes. On the Wednesday morning, Rex stopped at the collapsed stone outbuilding near the east fence and did not continue. Thomas called him. Rex looked back, looked at the outbuilding, and sat down. Thomas had passed that outbuilding every morning for 6 weeks. It was a small structure, or had been, built from fieldstone sometime before the Civil War, according to his father's description of it. The roof had gone decades ago, and most of the walls had followed, leaving a low rectangle of rubble that was half buried in blackberry cane and Virginia creeper. Thomas had noted it and moved on each time, but Rex had never sat down at it before, and Thomas had learned, over 7 years with this dog, that when Rex sat down at something, there was a reason. What was buried under that rubble would take Thomas 3 weeks, 1 phone call to the Army Records Center in St. Louis, and a property attorney in Charlottesville to fully understand. And it would end something that had been wrong on this land for 30 years. Earl Garrett had come home from Korea in 1953 with a bad shoulder, a quiet disposition, and a certainty about what he wanted that most 22-year-olds do not have. He wanted land. He wanted to work it himself. He wanted to be left alone to do it. He bought the 60 acres in Augusta County in 1962 with money he had saved and a small loan from a cousin. The land was not much at the time. Worked-out pasture, a farmhouse that needed everything. Earl spent the next 40 years making it into something. He kept cattle for 20 of those years, switched to hay when his back gave out, and eventually just maintained the land the way some men maintain a thing they love, which is carefully and without much discussion of why. He had 1 son, Thomas. Thomas had grown up on that land, left at 18 to enlist the way his father had, served 20 years in the Army, come out in 2000 as a staff sergeant with a body that worked and a preference for quiet that matched his father's. He settled in Roanoke. He drove out to the farm when he could. The neighbor to the east was a man named Gerald Calhoun, 3rd generation on the adjoining property, a larger farm that had been in the Calhoun family since the 1880s. Thomas had known the Calhouns growing up the way you know neighbors in rural counties, which is by sight and reputation more than by genuine acquaintance. The dispute over the east boundary had started in the early 1990s, before Thomas was paying close attention to his father's affairs. Gerald Calhoun's father, Raymond, had presented a deed at the county recorder's office showing that a 15-acre strip along the east boundary of Earl's property had been sold to the Calhouns in 1971. The deed bore Earl's signature. Earl had contested it. He said he had never signed that document. He said he had never agreed to sell any portion of the property and had no memory of any such transaction. But Earl was a man who kept things in his head rather than on paper. He had no copy of the original survey from 1962. He had no documentation that directly contradicted the Calhoun deed. The county recorder's office had the document on file. A handwriting analysis hired by a lawyer Earl could barely afford came back inconclusive. The dispute ground on for years, and then, the way disputes do when one party runs out of money and energy to fight them, it stopped. The Calhouns farmed the 15 acres. Earl watched them from his side of the fence and did not speak to them and never accepted it, but he also could not stop it. He was an old man, and he was tired, and the lawyer had cost him more than he had. He died without it being resolved. Thomas found out about the full history of the dispute from Earl's neighbor to the north, a woman named Agnes, who had known Earl for 40 years and who sat with Thomas on her porch one afternoon in late September and told him everything his father had never told him directly. When Agnes finished, Thomas sat with his coffee for a long time. Then he said, "My father was in Korea in 1971. Agnes looked at him. Thomas said, "The deed is dated 1971. My father enlisted in 1950 and served until 1953. He came back in 1953. Agnes said she thought he had meant his father's age, not his service. Thomas said no. He meant the dates were wrong. His father had been stateside continuously since 1953. He had not been in Korea in 1971. He had been on this property in 1971 because he had owned it since 1962. He stopped. Agnes said, "Then who signed that deed?" Thomas drove back to the farmhouse and called Rex in from the yard and sat at his father's kitchen table for a long time. The stone outbuilding had been a smokehouse, Earl had told him once, built before the main farmhouse, back when the property had been part of a larger holding. It sat exactly on the line of what would become the east boundary dispute, which Thomas had not thought about until the morning Rex sat down beside it and declined to move. Thomas spent 3 days carefully clearing the blackberry cane from around the collapsed walls. His hands were torn up by the second day, and he wore gloves after that. Rex supervised from a few feet away, moving only to follow Thomas when he went back to the farmhouse for water or tools. The rubble inside the old walls was 2 feet deep in places. Fieldstone, mortar dust, rotted roof timber, 60 years of leaves compressed into something close to soil. Thomas moved it piece by piece. On the 3rd day his hand closed on something that was not stone and not wood. He cleared the material around it carefully. It was a military footlocker, olive drab, stenciled with his father's name and service number in faded black paint. The hasp was rusted shut, but the body of it was intact. Thomas worked the hasp with a pry bar for 20 minutes before it gave. Inside, wrapped in an old wool army blanket that had kept the moisture out better than it had any right to after so many years, were 4 things: his father's Korean War discharge papers, official Army documentation, Earl Garrett's name and service number, and dates of service printed cleanly on the form. Discharge date, March 14th, 1953. A hand-drawn survey map of the 60 acres, dated 1961. 1 year before the purchase, which meant Earl had surveyed the land before he bought it. The east boundary was marked in his father's handwriting with a note, confirmed by County Survey Office, August 1961. The boundary ran exactly where Earl had always said it ran, 15 acres east of where the Calhouns currently farmed. a canvas pouch containing 3 Korean War service medals and a folded citation letter from the Army, dated 1953, and a sealed envelope, Earl's handwriting on the front. One word, Thomas. Thomas sat on the ground beside the footlocker with Rex against his leg and opened the envelope. His father had written the letter 2 years before he died. He wrote the way he talked, which was plain and without decoration. Earl wrote that he had found the footlocker in the smokehouse in 2003 when he was clearing the blackberry from around it. He had put it there himself in 1974, when the dispute with Raymond Calhoun was still new, and he was afraid the Calhouns might come to the farmhouse and take his documents. He had put them somewhere they would not look. Then he had gotten old, and his memory had gotten unreliable, and he hadn't been able to remember exactly where he had put them, and eventually he had stopped looking. He wrote that the discharge papers proved he was stateside from 1953 onward. He wrote that the 1961 survey showed the correct east boundary. He wrote that if Thomas was reading this letter, it meant he had found what Earl had hidden, and that he hoped he had found it in time to do something with it. He wrote, "The Calhouns have been farming land that belongs to us for 30 years on a signature that is not mine. I could never prove it. Maybe you can." Thomas read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it back in the envelope and sat with it for a while. Rex put his head on Thomas's knee. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then Thomas took out his phone and called directory assistance for Charlottesville, Virginia, and asked for a property law attorney. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. She had a practice in downtown Charlottesville and a specialty in Virginia land disputes that the receptionist mentioned before Thomas even finished explaining why he was calling. She saw him the following Monday. Sandra read the discharge papers first. She set them down and said, "Your father was discharged in March of 1953, and the disputed deed is dated when exactly?" Thomas said July 1971. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father could not have signed a deed in July 1971. He was living on this property continuously from 1962. He had no documented absence from Virginia of any kind after his discharge. Is that your understanding?" Thomas said it was. She picked up the 1961 survey. She compared the east boundary notation in Earl's handwriting with the boundary described in the disputed Calhoun deed. She set both documents down. She said, "The survey predates the deed by 10 years and establishes the boundary in a way that is directly inconsistent with the deed. Combined with the impossibility of your father's signature on a 1971 document, given his established presence in Virginia, what you have is a strong basis for a forgery claim." Thomas asked what that meant practically. Sandra said it meant filing a petition to void the 1971 deed on the grounds of fraud. It meant requesting a forensic handwriting analysis of the signature on the deed compared to verified samples of Earl's handwriting from the same period. It meant notifying the Calhoun family that the title to the 15-acre strip was being contested on those specific grounds. She said the Calhouns had been farming land under a fraudulent deed for approximately 30 years. The question of what remedies were available for the lost use of that land during that period was a separate matter, but the first step was invalidating the deed. Thomas said he wanted to proceed. She filed the petition the following week. The forensic handwriting analysis took 3 weeks. The analyst compared the signature on the 1971 deed to 6 verified samples of Earl Garrett's signature from documents dated between 1962 and 1970, including the original purchase agreement for the 60 acres, tax filings, and a bank loan document. The report was 12 pages. The conclusion was one sentence. The signature on the disputed deed of July 1971 was not consistent with the known handwriting samples of Earl Garrett and showed characteristics consistent with deliberate imitation by a different individual. Sandra filed the full petition with the analysis attached. Gerald Calhoun was 73 years old, and his father Raymond had been dead for 11 years. Gerald had grown up farming those 15 acres. He had inherited them the way you inherit something when you are a child, and do not know the full story of how it came to belong to your family. Thomas did not know how much Gerald knew. Sandra told him that was not the central question. The central question was the deed, and the deed was a forgery. Gerald's attorney requested 60 days to respond. Sandra agreed to 30. The response, when it came, did not contest the handwriting analysis. It proposed a settlement. Thomas and Sandra met with Gerald and his attorney in a conference room in Staunton on a Thursday in January. Gerald was a large man, quieter than Thomas had expected, and he did not look at Thomas for most of the meeting. The settlement was straightforward. The Calhoun family would quitclaim the 15 acres back to the Garrett estate, which meant to Thomas. In exchange, Thomas would not pursue damages for the 30 years of lost use, which Sandra had told him was a viable but complex claim that would take years and significant money to litigate. Thomas agreed to the terms. Gerald said one thing directly to Thomas as they were leaving. He said he had not known. He said his father had never told him. Thomas did not know if that was true. He did not say anything in response. He shook Gerald's hand because his father would have expected that, and walked out to his truck, where Rex was waiting in the passenger seat. The 15 acres came back to him in February. Thomas walked them for the first time in his life as land that was legally his, which felt different from walking them as disputed land, even though the ground was the same ground. Rex ran them. He covered the full 15 acres in a long, looping circuit that took him out to the new east fence line and back through the old pasture and down to where the boundary met the creek. He did it twice before he was satisfied. The stone outbuilding was still a ruin. Thomas had thought about rebuilding it, but decided against it for the time being. He cleared the remaining rubble and leveled the site, and left the fieldstone in a neat stack beside it. Someday he might use it for something, or he might not. It had already done the most important thing it was ever going to do. The footlocker was in the farmhouse now, in the bedroom that had been his father's. Thomas had cleaned the outside of it and oiled the hasp and put it against the wall under the window. The discharge papers and the survey and the medals were in a fireproof box with the property documents. The letter was in the drawer of the bedside table where his father had kept it when he was alive, except Thomas had replaced the old watch that had been there with the letter instead. He read it occasionally, not often, just when he needed to remember what his father had wanted him to know. Earl had written, "I should have told you all of this while I was alive. I am sorry I did not. I was not good at saying things out loud. You probably know that. Thomas did know that. It was one of the things he had inherited from his father, along with the 60 acres and the farmhouse and the quiet that settled over the property in the evening when the light went low over the pasture and the tree line went dark and there was nothing to hear but the creek and the birds. Rex slept inside now. He had always slept outside in Roanoke because the apartment was small, and Thomas had thought it was better for the dog to have the yard. But the farmhouse had 3 bedrooms and a porch that ran the full length of the south side, and there was no reason for a dog who had spent his whole life earning his keep to sleep outside. Rex had a bed in the corner of the main room. He used it as a base of operations, which meant he slept on it when he wanted to, and ignored it when he had other things to do, which was most of the time. Thomas stayed. He had not made a firm decision about it in the way you make firm decisions. He had just kept not leaving, which amounted to the same thing. He rented out the Roanoke apartment, turned down the consulting work he had been picking up since his retirement, and started paying attention to what 60 acres of Virginia Piedmont needed from a person who was willing to give it time. It needed fence work along the north boundary. It needed the creek crossing repaired before the spring rains made it impassable. It needed the hay cut in the south field before the scrub took it back entirely. Earl had managed all of it alone for 20 years. Thomas was 58, and his knees were not what they had been, and he was not going to manage it alone. He hired 2 men from the county who knew what they were doing and worked alongside them and learned what he needed to learn. By the second spring, the farm looked like itself again. Rex was 10 years old by then. He still walked the boundary every morning, east fence to north woodlot to South Creek and back, the same circuit he had established in the first week. He moved slower than he used to, but he was thorough. He did not miss anything. On a morning in April, almost 2 years after he had first sat down beside the collapsed smokehouse and declined to move until Thomas paid attention, Rex completed his boundary walk and came back to the south porch and lay down in a patch of morning sun and put his chin on his paws. Thomas brought his coffee out and sat in the chair beside him. The pasture was green. The fence line was straight. The east boundary ran exactly where Earl Garrett had always said it ran, confirmed by a survey from 1961 and a court ruling from the previous winter and the plain fact of the land itself. Rex closed his eyes. His breathing slowed and settled into the long, easy rhythm of a dog who has nothing left to prove and nowhere he would rather be, which was the truth for both of them. Every story on this channel starts the same way. A veteran and his dog, and something the dog knew before the man did. New story next week. Subscribe if you want to be here when it drops.